Hello guys, welcome to my channel. And today I will clarify a sci-fi dramatization movie called LX 2048, released in 2020. This movie got 4.9 out of 10 rating on IMDb and 45% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. So, do not wasting you time. Let's begin. The film starts with a scene from the close future where a characteristic cataclysm known as the heat up has made individuals stay inside. This peculiarity was brought about by the ceaseless bursting fieriness of the sun. Due to the uncaring conditions, individuals are using an imitation of themselves to work outside. While the imitation is shipped off to accomplish the work outside, individuals have become torpid as they don't have anything to do inside their homes. Subsequently, they have procured mental illnesses. Lithium X is the main medication that can help them be typical, as it can assist individuals with remaining in shape by giving vitamin D. Then, we are acquainted with Adam Bird, the lead character of the film. He is one of only a handful of exceptional living people to wake up right on time and to go to work. One day, in the wake of visiting a specialist, he gets to realize that he will die soon. A crushed Adam asks with the specialist concerning whether he has some other choices for endurance. The specialist likewise considers him lucky, later discovering that he has a protection plan from Premium 3 inches that will cover his youngster's training and childhood after his demise. Adam asks whether he might use the Premium 3 protection to get a solid heart clone. Yet, the specialist reacts that it is just achievable in the event that his better half consents to the terms. At the point when Adam hears this, he communicates his disappointment with his current relationship with his better half, which is very nearly separate. Adam likewise discovers that the specialist he is conversing with is a clone itself, which is safe by the beams of the sun. He further scorns how much the current society is by all accounts lowered in innovation. Subsequent to dissecting Adam's weak mental state, the specialist sets up so that him could see a therapist. In the accompanying scene, Adam is shown wearing a VR headset and conversing with his wife Rena. He reviles his better half during their discussion, since she doesn't appear to mind and really focus on the truth that he is passing on, and she likewise declines to see him up close and personal. Adam feels sorry for himself for cherishing his significant other in the primary spot and hangs up the telephone. A while later, Adam spruces up in a hazardous materials suit. What's more, drives his vehicle in the searing sun to his empty working environment. Here, we can see that the remainder of his collaborators have decided to telecommute. It seems like he works for a tech firm that represents considerable authority in VR assembling and creation. He is distant from everyone else in the whole office, sitting around the meeting table, contending with his associates practically. He encourages his supervisor to try not to put resources into computer-generated reality headsets, and on second thought center on the creation and exploration of in-creation, which he says will before long supplant VR. Afterward, Adam leaves his office and goes to the therapist for his arrangement. At the therapist's office, Adam portrays his sensation of being a solitary human walking outside in the intense hotness. In any case, the current specialist likewise appears to be a clone. At the point when Adam sees this, he shouts that in spite of the fact that the clones have every one of the abilities as the first ones, they come up short on a sensation of empathy and feelings. The film then, at that point, slices to an episode that happened months prior. Adam arrives at home after work, and tracks down his kids, messing around and partaking in the virtual world. He then, at that point, sees his wife unwinding in the virtual sunbathe in her room. Following a monotonous day at work, he draws in himself in virtual sex with a doll, which gives reenactments like genuine intercourse. During the peak of the scene, his wife Rena shows up in the room. Adam apologizes to her for not locking the entryway. Be that as it may, an irate Rena blames him for cheating on her with his online sweetheart. Adam attempts to clarify the abnormal circumstance to her, yet she overlooks him and leaves. This was the occurrence that lighted their antagonistic relationship. Back in the present, Adam awakens and grooms himself for the gathering that he has arranged with his family. At the point when he arrives at home, Rena won't meet him. Baffled, he calls Rena basically from the primary entry and takes steps to get through the entryway. At last, Rena acknowledges to meet him outside in any case, shows no pity or compassion toward the reality that he is dying. Starts from now, Adam attempts to disclose to her that he ought to be alive to make the family live joyfully in the future, and to defeat their costs. Yet, Rena resolvedly answers that she will cover every one of the costs including his clone, with the assistance of Premium 3. Adam tells her that his organization is close to insolvency, and the family won't get any protection benefit on the off chance that he passes on right now. Notwithstanding Adam's clarification, Rena rejects to involve Premium 3 for the clone of his heart. Furthermore, recommends he use Lithium X with the goal that he would get sufficient opportunity to save his bankrupt organization. The following day, Adam is seen calling the retirement home to talk with a man named Donald Stein. Be that as it may, finds no solution. From that point onward, he becomes focused and calls his artificial intelligence sweetheart named Maria. Maria, as by all accounts worried that he is crying, also attempts to comfort him. In spite of the way that Adam realizes Maria has been customized to cause him to feel better, he still accepts that she adores her. He lies on his bed, paying attention to the fantasy of Maria being with him. Out of nowhere, he awakens to Donald pointing a weapon at him. Donald gets some information about him, and regarding the chip innovation, Adam discloses that he attempted to call him before, as he accepts that he is the maker of the chip innovation. Adam, then, at that point, requests Donald's assistance to save his organization alongside his family. Adam, then, at that point, goes into a flashback and recalls an assistant named Dennis Ryan, complimenting him. And Rena for having 3 children. 3 children around then was exceptionally uncommon as the population was declining. And individuals were scarcely getting hitched and engaging in sexual relations. The representative then, at that point, proposes to them a protection strategy called Premium 3, which would assist them with cloning their lost relatives. The representative additionally uncovers that it is created by the boss hereditary architect Donald Stein. Rena appears to be amped up for the proposition, yet Adam seems wary. Back in the present, Adam lets Donald know that he tracked down him with the assistance of his dental records, and furthermore adulates him for being the dad of human cloning. Donald snickers at his words yet gestures in arrangement, letting him know that the expanded pigmentation of the cerebrum is beyond the realm of possibilities without utilizing the chip. After a couple of beverages, Donald opens up and says that after the large hotness up, he was doled out by the state to clone people who were not impacted by the sun. Adam communicates his disdain toward the possibility of cloning people, and needs to get acknowledged for what his identity is. Donald then, at that point, specifies that he additionally tracked down his genuine romance in his virtual sweetheart. The film again slices to the scene where Adam, also Rena, are battling after she tracked down Adam having a virtual sweetheart. Rena is disturbed by the way that a virtual young lady can fulfill him better than she could. After their contention, Rena proposes that their relationship would possibly work if Adam erases his virtual sweetheart. Adam rejects, and their relationship closes. In the present, both Donald and Adam are currently associated with one another at one more level, later an evening of drinking and smoking together. Donald claims that he can fabricate a clone heart for Adam. He additionally adds that the aggravation Adam is feeling is passionate rather than physiological, and reasons that his heart is typical. Adam is feeling torment for the explanation of not taking Lithium X. Donald acknowledges the reality that he too made the clone of his virtual sweetheart, Maria, for fulfillment. He then, at that point, bought his opportunity by selling the licenses of the innovation of making the chip. For the bond they have shaped, Donald vows to help Adam by making a clone of his virtual sweetheart Maria. The following morning, Adam calls his mom and has a peculiar outlook on her symbol, which she made to be essentially more youthful. His mom inquires as to whether he takes Lithium X consistently. On hearing this, Adam communicates his disdain towards the medication. He then, at that point, sees his hand being singed by the sun and quickly covers the windows. Late around evening time, Rena visits him and asks about his prosperity. She is there with an arrangement to get sufficiently close to Premium 3's honors without Adam's passing. She discloses to him the possibility of virtual death, and furthermore, makes reference to that somebody she knows will make the administrative work needed for the state to support his demise. Adam is stunned to hear it and asks Rena what will happen to him. Rena recommends him to do whatever he feels like and furthermore, communicates that she has no issue to be with Maria. From the beginning, Adam won't acknowledge her proposition yet. Subsequent to knowing how much his better half detests him, Adam hesitantly consents to do it. Rena then, at that point, illuminates him that she has as of now done it and kisses him. Rena then, at that point, gives him his new ID and his accreditations. However, Adam is stressed over the way that he can presently don't converse with his better half Maria as he isn't Adam Bird any longer. His new name is viewed as Richard Burbage. Rena apologizes for changing his character, and furthermore, guarantees him that she will ask the cloned Adam not to erase Maria. At the point when Rena is going to return back, a van hits her, killing her right away. After a few time, police and paramedics show up at the scene. One of the officials contacts Adam and communicates his sympathies, and furthermore proposes he see an advisor. He goes through Adam's profile, and finds out that they are on a Premium 3 protection plan. He guarantees him that a superior adaptation of Rena will show up inside certain days, and will take care of the youngsters. Following the official's flight, Adam returns to his room, and endeavors to get into his record, just to find that the entirety of his accreditations have been changed. An anxious Adam, then, at that point, makes himself vomit to dispose of the liquor in his framework. Inevitably, he sees that somebody is at the entryway. At the point when he connects, he finds Maria, who begins kissing him energetically. Adam is shocked and can't take his look away from Maria, as she is the young lady of his dreams. He needs to get physically involved with her. However, Maria makes reference to that she is as yet going through Donald's tests. After some time, Adam finds that Donald had intercourse to Maria prior to moving her to his home. Adam goes overboard, and Maria encourages him to quiet down. She likewise lets him know that she has the right to investigate different potential outcomes. Afterward, Adam sees Maria showering. He then, at that point, enters the family room and starts looking through Maria's tote. Inside, he finds assurance and a straightforward chip. After Maria is finished showering, Adam stands up to her about the chip. She reacts that the chip can download and communicate the total mind of a perishing individual to the virtual world. Adam is shocked when he discovers that a single chip might hold an entire individual. Adam gazes at Maria, both dazzled and unnerved. As she means to leave, Adam beseeches her to remain with him. In any case, Maria rejects, guaranteeing that her body's cells are coordinated to fall head over heels, however, not with him. Following Maria's takeoff, an overjoyed Adam dances with the joy doll that Maria once was. He then, at that point, takes a gander at the doll with rankled eyes. What's more, starts wounding it with a blade numerous times. In the following scene, Adam is seen lying in a corner, with his body shuddering. A ring at the entryway stirs him up from his miserable state, and he slithers to the entryway, as it were to be welcomed by Rena's admired adaptation of himself. Cloned Adam discusses their significant other's demise with a cooler disposition and appearance. He then, at that point, starts to pass judgment on the genuine Adam based on his appearance and the condition of his home. He likewise lets him know that he would not hurt him, since he was made to just utilize viciousness with good reason. Clone Adam acclaims Rena and says that she is an incredible lady, yet the genuine Adam can't see this as a result of his obliviousness. This while the genuine Adam is stunned to see the clone's appearance. He then, at that point, requests that clone Adam strip in front of him to check his body structure. In the wake of seeing all of this, the genuine Adam starts blustering and faulting Donald for his present status. He likewise asks about clone Adam's viewpoints on killing Donald. Genuine Adam is disturbed by the way that the cloned Adam is greater at everything than him. The clone communicates compassion toward the genuine Adam and solicitations that he embrace his new life. This bothers the genuine Adam, and he conveys a firearm with him. Clone Adam, then, at that point, follows genuine Adam to the room he enters, saying that he ought to have the option to acknowledge the progressions occurring in the public arena. He additionally predicts that in the not too far off future, everybody will relocate to the computerized domain. Genuine Adam, then, at that point, reviews the way that he can't be alive in our current reality, where another Adam exists, so he focuses the weapon at the clone. While trying to save himself, the clone reminds Adam why Rena supplanted him. He then, at that point, recollects that he has died. Clone Adam, then, at that point, recommends genuine Adam take the lithium X pill to calm him down. As he is going to do as such, he recuperates from the control and points the firearm at clone Adam. The guard component of the clone kicks in. Furthermore, the weapon sneaks off genuine Adam's hand. Furthermore, drops to the table, making the firearm fire directly through the brow of genuine Adam. In the following scene, cloned Adam is covering the genuine Adam. In the wake of getting back, he invests in some opportunity to pick from the two arrangements of garments. At last, the clone of Rena additionally shows up at the entryway, and both of them interface with each other quickly. Inside the house, both of them share an cozy second, and furthermore plan to supplant their kids with more brilliant ones with the assistance of Premium 3.